So that's a bit of a puzzle. So the question is, why is it that the person, as it were, castigates themselves for being not sort of fully developed, when it's not even their fault? So it's like I told you of the man I treated who had a club foot. He wasn't only ashamed of it, but he also had this very powerful type of sense that he was useless and hopeless, and a sort of voice told him so. Now, I think Lord Melbourne, who was Queen Victoria's first Prime Minister, and he was her sort of mentor. She became Queen at the age of 18, and he was her sort of wise mentor. He said, "It wounds a man much less to confess that he's failed in any pursuit through idleness, neglect, or love of pleasure, etc., which are his own faults, than through an incapacity and unfitness, which are," Lord Melbourne called, "the faults of nature." Lord Melbourne is saying here that I find it preferable to accuse myself of idleness than to acknowledge that my capacity for love, for instance, is not well developed, or for receptivity, or my capacity for sensitivity to others is poorly developed. The question quite why that is, I think one of the reasons is to see this sort of undeveloped state does open, it sort of requires a type of openness to one's own self and also the whole sort of world around. And paradoxically, it's preferable, it's almost like an anesthetic, to have a sort of a castigating voice. And I said in answer to one of the questions last time in that case that I presented, Bernadette, who used to stick the knife into her stomach, it was her own incapacity to manage her children. It was like an anesthetic almost against the pain of that incapacity. And when she developed and began to get better and was able to look after her children again, she actually felt the pain of her sort of inability to mother in the way she wanted. But then she also stopped sticking knives into her stomach. Now, I want to try and spend a bit of time reflecting on the actual act of understanding, because I think it is through understanding that the sort of psychotic area in the personality is healed, or it can be healed. And this is partly because the act of understanding is not an isolated matter. And again, I want to stress it's transitive. If I have an act of understanding about someone there, it's not just isolated within myself. It is in its nature transitive before any words have been spoken. Now, when I understand something, I have engaged in an action. Now, I often distinguish between what I call motor action and emotional action. Motor action is sort of walking or running or and so on. Emotional action are those activities that engage me in communication with another. But in order to, as it were, enter into the inner world of another, which that's what we mean by understanding, I need some instrument with which to achieve that purpose. All actions need an instrument. I need a saw to cut through a piece of wood. I need a spade to dig my garden. I need a pen to write a letter. And all internal emotional actions also need an instrument as well. So it's like there's an action, but then there's an instrument. And I need an instrument to connect to the inner life of another So the question is, what is the instrument that I need? And where do I find it, and where do I get it from? And in order to try and illustrate this, I want to tell you a story that concerned myself and a young teenage patient that I saw 30 years ago now. This was a young girl of 15, and she went to a seaside resort with her parents. And she was playing on the beach, making a sandcastle while her parents went swimming in the sea. There was an undertow, or rip, and her mother and father were carried out to sea and were unable to get back to the shore, and they were struggling in the ocean in a helpless state. Luckily, the lifeguards saw them and went out in a lifeboat and pulled the two of them into the boat and brought them back to shore. They placed them on the sand and set about giving them the kiss of life. A ring of people surrounded these sort of like two bodies, immobile bodies lying on the sand, and their 15-year-old daughter, my patient, joined them. As she was standing there looking at her inert parents, she heard one of the people say, "They're dead." Now, fortunately, as it happened, the lifeguards managed to revive them, and they lived. A week later, the young teenager was back at school, but in a very rebellious state. She didn't do her homework, didn't pay attention in class, so she was sent to see a psychotherapist who happened to be me. Now, she told me the incident that I've just described, and although I felt sorry for her and realized how upsetting it was, I had not understood. Then she told me again, and it's always a sign, I think, if someone tells you something a second time, that they intuit that you haven't understood. So she told me again, and I suddenly realized that when she heard the man saying they're dead, her parents had died. She'd suffered the shock of their death. And she said to me, and when I got back to school, everyone acted as if nothing had happened. At that moment, I realized with shock that she'd undergone the death of her parents without any support. If her parents had really physically died, friends and relatives would have gathered around her in support. But this death, which was a real death for her, was unseen, and so she was left on her own with it. Now, how was it that I was suddenly able to understand? I saw her standing on the stand, I can still see her, among a ring of strangers, looking at the inert bodies of her parents, hearing someone saying, "They're dead." What was it that gave me that act of understanding? It was the image of her standing watching her dead parents, standing there uncomforted among strangers. At that moment, I was a young teenager myself, watching my parents like corpses on the beach, with someone saying they're dead. I think the central image was of being alone with my parents on whom I had totally relied, suddenly dead in front of me. The image of my parents, my own parents, driving away, leaving me in a boarding school in another country and 1,000 miles from home, and me being left alone among teachers and boys who were all strangers, came to me. So when she told me a second time, the image of my own experience, I think, was the instrument that enabled me to have that act of understanding.